A boy with a deformed skull stood in the shadows of Charleston's crumbling streets, fists clenched, rage boiling beneath his skin. Nobody knew it then, but this outcast child would one day control the heartbeat of Harlem and strike fear into the souls of gangsters, cops, and kingpins alike. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, but the world would come to know him by another name, a name whispered in back alleys, feared in boardrooms, and immortalized in legend. This is the story of how a broken boy from the Jim Crow South became Bumpy Johnson, Harlem's most feared figure. If you're fascinated by untold stories of power, survival, and transformation, hit that subscribe button now, because we're diving deep into the hidden origins of one of America's most notorious crime bosses. Before Bumpy Johnson ruled Harlem's underworld in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, before he became the so-called godfather of Harlem, before his name was synonymous with power, respect, and ruthless intelligence, he was just a kid. A poor black kid born into a world that wanted him to disappear. But Bumpy Johnson didn't disappear. He fought, he survived, and he learned lessons in those early years that would shape everything he became. Lessons about violence, loyalty, resilience, and power. This isn't just a story about a gangster, it's a story about America, about what happens when a system crushes a child and that child decides to crush back. So how did a boy born in 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina, a city still reeling from the Civil War and drowning in racial hatred, become one of the most intelligent, feared, and respected figures in organized crime? Let's go back to the beginning. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born on October 31, 1905, in Charleston, South Carolina. Halloween, a day of masks, shadows, and hidden identities. The irony wouldn't be lost on history. His parents, William and Margaret Johnson, were working-class black citizens trying to survive in one of the most oppressive regions in America. This was the Deep South during Jim Crow. Segregation wasn't just law, it was suffocating reality. Black families lived under constant threat: lynchings, economic exploitation, police brutality, and systemic erasure. Charleston was a city haunted by its own history. Once a thriving port for the Atlantic slave trade, it was now a powder keg of racial tension. Confederate flags still flew, white supremacist groups operated openly. Black children like Ellsworth grew up knowing they were considered less than human by the society around them. But here's the twist. Ellsworth wasn't just fighting racism. He was fighting his own body. From birth, Ellsworth had a large, noticeable bump on the back of his head, a cyst-like deformity that made him a target for ridicule, bullying, and cruelty. Other kids mocked him. Adults stared. In a world already hostile to black existence, Ellsworth carried an additional burden: physical difference. And that bump, that's where his nickname came from. They called him Bumpy. But instead of breaking him, that nickname became armor. Bumpy didn't shrink. He didn't hide. He learned early that the world was violent, unfair, and unforgiving. And if he wanted to survive, he had to be more violent, more unfair, and more unforgiving than anyone else. His childhood in Charleston was defined by poverty and rage. His family struggled to make ends meet. His father worked grueling manual labor jobs. His mother did domestic work for white families, cleaning their homes, raising their children, enduring their disrespect. Young Bumpy watched. He absorbed. He seethed. He saw his parents humiliated daily. He saw black men beaten in the streets for disrespecting white authority. He saw entire communities kept in chains without literal shackles, just laws, violence, and fear. And something inside him hardened. Bumpy was smart, exceptionally smart. Teachers noticed. He was sharp, quick-witted, curious. But intelligence without opportunity is like gunpowder without a spark. In Charleston, there was no future for a brilliant black boy. No college, no career, no escape. Except one. By the time Bumpy was a teenager, he'd already crossed the line into crime. Not because he was inherently evil, but because crime was the only system that offered him power, respect, and survival. He started small: petty theft, street scams, running numbers, but even then, people noticed something different about him. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't impulsive. He was calculating, strategic, cold. One local hustler later said, "Most kids stole because they were stupid. Bumpy stole because he was smart." But Charleston wasn't big enough for Bumpy's ambitions or his anger. In 1919, when Bumpy was just 14 years old, something happened that changed everything. The details remain murky, shrouded in conflicting accounts and legend. Some say Bumpy got into a violent altercation with a white shopkeeper who disrespected his mother. Others say he was involved in a street fight that turned deadly. A few whispers suggest he witnessed, or participated in, something far darker. What we know for certain is this: Bumpy Johnson had to leave Charleston, fast. Whether he was running from the law, from vigilantes, or from his own demons, the message was clear: stay in Charleston, and he'd end up dead or imprisoned. So his parents made a desperate decision. They sent their teenage son north to Harlem to live with his older sister. But here's the question that haunted Bumpy for the rest of his life. Was he escaping Charleston, or was Charleston creating the monster he was destined to become? If this story is revealing sides of Bumpy Johnson you've never heard before, smash that like button. It helps more people discover these hidden chapters of history. In 1919, Bumpy Johnson arrived in Harlem. He was 14 years old, alone, angry, and hungry for something he couldn't yet name. Harlem in 1919 was exploding. The Great Migration was in full swing, hundreds of thousands of Black Americans fleeing the Jim Crow South, searching for freedom, opportunity, and dignity in northern cities. Harlem became the epicenter of Black culture, creativity, and ambition. The Harlem Renaissance was just beginning. Jazz filled the air. Poets, artists, intellectuals gathered in speakeasies and salons. But Harlem wasn't paradise. It was chaos, overcrowded, impoverished, segregated, exploited by white landlords, white business owners, white cops. Black residents faced discrimination in housing, employment, and daily life. And into that powder keg of frustration and desperation, organized crime flourished. Harlem's underworld was a brutal, cutthroat ecosystem. Mobsters, both black and white, controlled gambling, bootlegging, prostitution, and drug trafficking. Violence was currency, respect was survival, and young Bumpy Johnson walked right into the fire. At first, he was nobody. Just another kid from the South, trying to figure out the rules of a new, ruthless game. He lived with his sister, attended school sporadically, and spent most of his time on the streets, watching, learning, plotting. Harlem's street corners became his classroom. He studied the hustlers, the pimps, the gamblers, the enforcers. He learned who had power and how they wielded it. He learned that intelligence was a weapon, sometimes deadlier than a knife or a gun. And he learned that respect in Harlem wasn't given, it was taken. By his mid-teens, Bumpy had dropped out of school entirely and immersed himself in Harlem's criminal underworld. He started running errands for local gangsters, delivering packages, collecting debts, providing muscle when needed. But Bumpy was different from other young enforcers. He didn't just follow orders, he thought 3 steps ahead. He didn't just use violence, he used psychology. He understood people, their fears, their weaknesses, their motivations. One story from this era has become legendary, though its exact details are debated. A local loan shark hired teenage Bumpy to collect a debt from a man who'd been dodging payment for weeks. Most enforcers would have kicked down the door, beaten the guy, and taken whatever they could find. Not Bumpy. He studied the debtor, learned his routines, discovered he had a young daughter he adored. So Bumpy showed up at the man's door calmly, politely, and simply mentioned that it would be a shame if anything happened to interfere with the girl's safety. The debt was paid within hours. No violence, no mess, just cold, calculated intimidation. Word spread fast. This kid Bumpy? He's smart, and being smart is dangerous. But intelligence alone doesn't make a legend. Harlem's streets demanded something more, something primal. They demanded blood, and Bumpy was about to spill it. In the early 1920s, Harlem's underworld was controlled by various factions: Italian mobsters, Irish gangs, and a rising class of black criminals fighting for their piece of the pie. Racial tensions simmered, territorial disputes erupted into shootouts. Loyalty was tested daily. Bumpy aligned himself with Harlem's black gangsters, but he wasn't blindly loyal. He was strategic. He built alliances carefully, studied power dynamics, and positioned himself as indispensable, smart enough to plan, ruthless enough to execute, and disciplined enough to survive. And then came his first major conflict, a violent confrontation that would cement his reputation. Details are scarce, but multiple accounts suggest that in his late teens, Bumpy was involved in a brutal street war between rival factions. Some say it was over territory. Others say it involved a betrayal, a stolen shipment, or a personal vendetta. What's clear is this: Bumpy didn't just survive the conflict. He dominated it. He orchestrated ambushes. He outmaneuvered older, more experienced criminals. He demonstrated a terrifying combination of intelligence and ruthlessness that left even hardened gangsters shaken. One contemporary later recalled, "Bumpy was calm when everyone else panicked. That's what made him terrifying. You'd think he was your friend, right up until he put a bullet in you." By his early 20s, Bumpy Johnson was no longer a kid from Charleston trying to survive. He was a rising force in Harlem's underworld, feared, respected, and impossible to ignore. But the question remains: what transformed that bullied, angry boy into one of the most feared figures in American crime? The answer lies in something deeper than violence, something forged in the fires of Charleston, tempered in the chaos of Harlem, and sharpened by every betrayal, every fight, every moment he refused to be crushed. Think about it. If you'd grown up in Bumpy's shoes, facing that kind of systemic violence and humiliation, what would you have done? Would you have fought back, or would you have tried to play by the rules? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear your perspective. Let's step back and understand what really happened here. Bumpy Johnson's early years weren't just a prelude to his criminal career. They were the foundation of everything he became. In Charleston, he learned that society would never protect him, that laws were weapons used against people who looked like him, that the only justice he'd ever receive was the justice he created himself. In Harlem, he learned that intelligence was power, that fear and respect were intertwined, that in a world designed to destroy him, survival required ruthlessness, strategy, and an unshakable sense of self. But here's what makes Bumpy's story so complex, so compelling, and so tragic. He wasn't a monster. He was a product of systemic racism, economic desperation, and a society that offered black men two choices: submit or fight. Bumpy chose to fight. And he didn't just fight for survival, he fought for power, for dignity, for control over his own fate. By the mid-1920s, Bumpy Johnson was becoming a legend in Harlem. He wasn't the kingpin yet. That would come later in the 1930s and 40s, when he'd form alliances with Italian mobsters, challenge rival gangs, and eventually become the de facto ruler of Harlem's criminal underworld. But the seeds were planted in those early years: the rage, the intelligence, the refusal to bow, and the nickname, Bumpy, became a symbol, not of deformity or weakness, but of resilience, of survival, of a man who refused to let the world define him. So what's the takeaway here? Bumpy Johnson's early years reveal an uncomfortable truth about America. We create the very monsters we fear. We build systems of oppression, violence, and humiliation. And then we act shocked when people fight back with the only tools we've left them. Bumpy wasn't born a criminal. He was born into a country that criminalized his existence from day one. And instead of breaking, he became something the system couldn't control: intelligent, powerful, and utterly unafraid. His story is a mirror. It reflects the brutal realities of race, class, and power in 20th century America. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about justice, morality, and survival. Was Bumpy Johnson a hero, a villain, or something far more complicated? The answer depends on who's telling the story and what they choose to see. What's undeniable is this: that boy from Charleston, mocked for a bump on his head, became a legend, a symbol of resistance, defiance, and the refusal to be erased. Harlem's most feared figure wasn't born in a single moment. He was forged across years of pain, rage, brilliance, and survival. And his legacy? It's still being written. If this deep dive into Bumpy Johnson's origins fascinated you, don't stop here. Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we're just getting started with untold stories of power, crime, and survival.